The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
Fraud, and more fraud. Of course, I'm going to say that I work in the counter-fraud industry. Is the real driver of all action now. With fraud, there is money laundering. So we cannot look at the two in isolation. They've got to start putting those two policy areas together.
Money makes a world go round. It makes a world go round.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance and financial crime to the real world. The UK has recently had a pretty significant shake-up. After 14 years of the Conservative Party at the helm, with 5 different prime ministers in that time, July's general election saw a huge swing to the Labour Party, who pledged to provide a different kind of politics.
Changing a country is not like flicking a switch. The world is now a more volatile place. This will take a while, but have no doubt that the work of change begins immediately.
This month, newly elected Prime Minister Keir Starmer reached the milestone of 100 days in charge, which means it's time to look at what's been achieved so far, what manifesto promises are yet to get off the ground, and what scandals may have got in the way. I'm your host, Lycka, Solutions Architect at Strise, and in this episode we're asking, what impact has the new UK government had on financial crime and compliance? We'll be discussing what have been the significant changes under Keir Starmer's time in charge so far, what have been the biggest challenges of the first 100 days when it comes to compliance, sanctions and regulation, and what can we expect going forward. To dive into this topic, I'm joined by Helena Wood, who is Director of Public Policy and Strategic Engagement at Cifas and an Associate Fellow of RUSI's Center of Finance and Security. Welcome to The Laundry, Helena.
Great to be here.
Can you tell your listeners about you, your background, and your various roles?
Brilliant. Well, yeah, great to be here. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Cifas. We are the UK's data sharing platform for countering fraud. We've been doing that for 35 years and showing that you can share data despite GDPR concerns. So we can do that in practice. Prior to that, I was the head of the Economic Crime Plan Programme at RUSI's Centre for Finance and Security, where I kept the previous government, on its toes by tracking all the implementation of its previous economic crime policy. Prior to that, I spent most of my time in the public sector in the UK, with most of that time at the UK's National Crime Agency.
Super exciting. It sounds so dry to a lot of people, but to me, it's like you're the OG of like sharing data and actually creating a database. It's so exciting for me to have you on the show. Let's dive into the topics. Financial crime is rarely at the very top of the political agenda, but it's obviously very important. From what you've seen so far, how seriously is the new government taking this issue?
Well, I think we could actually look back further, so to the pre-election period, to look at what the Labour Party, now in government, was saying in opposition. And we were hearing some really good mood music in opposition from these guys. So 2 areas, domestic policy and foreign policy. On the latter, David Lammy, our now Foreign Secretary, made a speech at the Institute for Public Policy Research, a think tank that obviously looks at areas of public policy, back in May, where he put a huge focus on the anti-kleptocracy agenda.
What we know is that there's dirty Russian money in London. What we know is that whilst Vladimir Putin might not care about his own general public, he does care about money, and rich people associated with him need to feel the squeeze.
Now, obviously, some political posturing there, given the alleged previous government's connections to some quite murky individuals, I should say alleged. But he really wanted to create that clear water between the Labour Party and their then incumbent Conservative government. And for me, that was really significant. Having worked in this field for about 20 years, it's the first time we've really seen dirty money on the foreign policy agenda, rather than it being seen as a domestic issue or a criminal justice issue to solve. It really showed that the Labour government got the links between global laundromats, global kleptocracy, and its own national interest and their own foreign policy agenda. So I think that's really significant. We're yet to see that play out in UK foreign policy. I think that's perhaps because it's quite a busy agenda right now. I don't need to tell listeners that the world is in somewhat of a place of turmoil. So we'll see how that plays out in practice. But I think we'll certainly see it come out in the development agenda. I think we're going to start seeing more action on that going forward, particularly as that tension grows between the UK and Russia.
So they even propose punishing white-collar enablers of kleptocracy and offer rewards up to £250,000 to whistleblowers who identify sanction breaches. This is quite controversial in itself, of actually offering a reward in this sense. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I'm a pragmatist at heart. Having worked in this field, you can be a purist. There are some issues about driving people to take action from a moral perspective. Yeah, sure. But when it comes to enabling these types of crimes, the types of people who you need to blow the whistle are often paid, six-figure salaries, huge salaries. It's very difficult for them to make that moral choice in a set of circumstances where they are having to live up to a certain standard. So for me, it's a pragmatic issue. I think you need those people to step forward to blow open these kind of enabling rings. We can't possibly hope to do that through the types of tools that I was using to try and bust drug trafficking rings. It's a very different magnitude. So it's a point of pragmatism. You've got to go and start paying whistleblowers.
So are we seeing the government engage with the compliance and AML community directly? Do you think it's a priority for them?
Absolutely. So again, I'd look back to opposition where our now economic secretary in our Treasury Department, Tulip Sadiq, was really, walking around the city, the UK's financial district, and banging on the door to show that the Labour Party, previously seen as being quite unfriendly to the financial sector, is a friend of that particular area. So real engagement and a real understanding that, bankers are part of the solution. They're not necessarily the enemy in all cases, though obviously more could be done. But I think we're seeing a really grown-up version of the Labour Party that is engaging with the industry to see them as part of the solution, which I think is quite a change in tone.
Easily, the most significant regulatory change passed in the first 100 days has been the app fraud reimbursement. Maybe we should quickly explain to people what app scams are. Like authorized push payments is the abbreviation. Could you quickly explain what it actually is?
So this is instances where we're all used to this now. Sadly, how many calls do we all get a day? How many texts where people are socially engineered into making the payment themselves, which is quite a contrast to where we were, say, even a decade, 2 decades ago, where fraud was predominantly about card misuse. So you'd look at your statement, some money had gone out, you hadn't made that payment, you spoke to your bank and you were reimbursed. As the controls were put in place to try and mitigate against this, the fraudsters had to move to, if you'll forgive me, the weakest point in the system, which is inevitably the human. And we've seen not only in the UK, but globally, and huge uptick in levels of social engineering scams. So this is a huge problem in the UK. It's grown exponentially. And if you look globally, also, I'm sure where you're sat today, and not even confined to the Northern Hemisphere, this is also a developing country issue as well. So the social engineering type scams that people are facing on a daily basis.
And we talk a lot about Gen AI on the podcast as well, and how good the scams have actually become. Like previously, you could easily kind of recognize the language, or you recognize that there's something, but the scams are becoming so good. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Despite my best efforts, I've actually been defrauded myself in one of these app scams.
Well, you're not alone. I mean, I forget which UK financial institution, but the head of counter fraud in one institution was duped. These are really sophisticated. We shouldn't see people as being in any way stupid. They are incredibly sophisticated, and it's going to get worse. So there's been a huge amount of pressure to take action, particularly as the UK, by dint of being quite a rich country, English speaking, was really being hit quite early on in this global, if we call it an epidemic of scams. Though that is changing. Gen AI is helping, particularly in terms of some of the more complex languages like Norwegian. It's allowing people to target beyond the English language. But yeah, it's a huge issue here, and has been way before this government got into place.
And they've set the maximum reimbursement limit to £85,000, and over 99% of the app claims will be covered by the reimbursement cap. So these fraud cases will cost British residents around 430 million in 2023. So this was in the works before Labour came into power. But how significant is their backing to this?
That's really a really interesting question. I mean, if I'm being slightly cynical, which I am wont to be often about economic crime policy, this was a significant pressure on the previous government due to a failure in their ability to take action through policing, which had faced huge cuts here in the UK through austerity, which we saw from the start of the Conservative government back in 2010. So they had to do something. There was a huge amount of consumer pressure and from their own backbenches. So initially, this policy was brought in mandatory reimbursement. You must reimburse even where the victim has themselves pushed the payment through the system. Originally, prior to the Labour government coming in, the cap was set at £415,000. So somebody is lobbying very, very well and is probably going to get their bonus this year in the financial industry because they've lobbied that down to £85,000, which is a significant drop. However, I think, that's a gain for the financial industry. Consumer groups are up in arms, of course, as you'd expect. But as you point out, 99% of those claims are below that threshold. And I think we can look wider than economic crime policy into kind of Labour's wider kind of industrial strategy and kind of place of the UK going forward. They really want to position the UK as a centre for fintech, payment service provision, and a kind of more dynamic financial industry than we see beyond the bricks and mortar. And simply, if you set that cap too high, it's going to reduce competition in the system. I mean, people won't want to shoulder that burden. In those smaller PSPs, those smaller payment service providers, they simply cannot shoulder a close to £500,000 payout. So I think it's a really pragmatic response that's balancing the needs of consumers, but also the need of the UK to remain agile and a kind of startup place for fintechs and that kind of diverse set of payment service providers to increase competition.
Politico described it as banks just won a multi-million-pound lobbying battle against UK fraud rules. So how important do you think it was, the balancing of the industry and the public's best interest when it came to the reimbursement cap?
They have inherited this policy, and if I'll guard against making my own personal judgment on whether that particular policy is a good idea. But they couldn't reverse on it. It was simply going to be too unpopular. But it is somewhat of a global experiment if we look at this. Everyone else is looking in on the UK to see how this plays out in practice. Because yes, something had to be done. Consumers were losing out. But this is a huge, despite the drop, this is a huge burden on financial services in terms of financial burden. They will have to have reserves in place to pay for this. And it will make the UK perhaps less attractive. Whilst at the same time, the question is, will this make the UK more of a target or not? Will it drive, greater abuse of this system by individuals? Will there be an increase in crime as a service provisions? We'll already see it in other areas like online retail, where people will set up a service for me or you to pay them 10% and then claim a refund on the big ticket item they've ordered, for example. Are we? I would suggest yes. We're going to see those sorts of unintended consequences come through.
And another significant development has been around the defrauding of public money through the COVID pandemic. Can you explain what's happening here at the moment?
Yes, in opposition, again, during that time, we're not alone in the UK of kind of having to stand up significant provision to support our different industries, small businesses. And inevitably, as we know in the counter-fraud industry, where there is money, there will be abuse. Of course there will be. Some might say that the UK system that was stood up during the COVID pandemic did not include enough provision for counter-fraud. And thus, money was coming out the door. We were hearing horror stories of, systematic organised crime attacks on some of our COVID support schemes.
Yeah, we saw that more than £600 million worth of COVID contracts were awarded during the pandemic. And Transparency International research found that 135 high-risk contracts with at least 3 red flags, warning signs of risk of corruption, were awarded. So there are significant numbers.
Today I can announce that I am beginning the process to appoint a COVID corruption commissioner to get back what is owed to the British people. Because that money today in the hands of fraudsters belongs in our public services, and we want that money back.
Yeah, I think a slightly separate issue on public procurement, of course, which again, some might say it would have been better to have gone slightly slower. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but we are where we are now. We've had significant abuse of some of those more public-facing schemes, business support schemes, COVID grants. We had a interesting eat out to help out scheme where restaurants could claim back for people eating out at that time to try and reinvigorate the restaurant industry. All of those schemes have been abused because perhaps you could say there weren't enough checks put in place. And as you would expect, Labour in opposition used that to their advantage to make the case that we need to do something about it. We need to start clawing some of that money back. As I understand it, they've just finished recruiting for the COVID commissioner, so COVID counter-fraud commissioner here. We'll have a name soon. But if you look behind that job advert, it's a 1-year contract for a start. Who's going to walk away from a career for a 1-year contract? Secondly, the salary is £84,000 a year. Now, I'm not saying that's not a significant amount of money. I would question the calibre of individual who's going to walk away from a job for £84,000 in London, which sounds a lot, but it's not when you're having to face the cost of living in the capital of the UK, and who's going to walk away from a good job for a 1-year contract. So I'll be interesting to see who kind of fronts that position. And there will also be a huge amount of pressure on that individual. So who's going to take that job? I certainly wasn't putting my name in the hat. I'll put it out.
Yeah, after that comment, I hope it's no one you know.
I know, let's hope they're not listening. I hope someone will be willing to take a job just for the public good. And there are those individuals out there, of course. But, can we really expect someone who's active in the industry to walk away? I'm hoping we'll get someone of a great caliber towards the end of their career who can afford to make those choices. I can't think of any right now.
We need a kindle spirit for this job. Okay, we'll be right back to talk about how things will look at the challenges facing this government, the future, and some quick-fire questions for Helena. Don't go anywhere.
Our overall goal at Strise? Eradicate financial crime. To achieve this, we know we have to build a network of expert partners to put together the ultimate package for compliance and AML teams globally. Let's hear what Plenitude, the leading independent consultancy in financial crime compliance, and one of our partners has to say.
The single biggest issue that are facing our clients in regulated firms at the moment is the increasing cost of compliance. Some of the pain points that clients are trying to address is that requirement to automate both AML and KYC controls. We've been working with Strise initially on a proof of concept exercise to test their solutions in the UK marketplace, but now we've formalised that partnership and we're now in a position to obviously offer to our clients Strise solutions alongside advisory and implementation support as part of deployment of those solutions. One of the things that we really like about Strise and their solutions is it does enable our clients to realise the benefits of AI relatively quickly, and the implementation timelines are relatively short compared to other solutions.
Want to work together? Visit strise.ai and click Become a Partner to book a meeting.
Okay, having looked at the impact so far, let's move on to the challenges this new government is facing already and what the future might hold. There's also the ongoing issue of Londongrad. Following the invasion of Ukraine 2020, government ministers called for the mansions of Russian magnates to be seized to house Ukrainian refugees. Wouldn't that be like a political justice of sorts? Others suggested taking the Russian assets in Britain's bank to help fund Ukraine's defense or to help rebuild Ukraine after the war. None of this have actually happened, though, so Labour repeated the pledge in their manifesto. What will we need to see to turn the rhetoric on this into action?
Brilliant. Yes, I think there's been a huge amount of focus on this particular issue, and rightly so. But if I may use a bit of English idiom, it's like locking the stable door after the horse has bolted. We've had a huge, I don't need to probably remind listeners that UK has had a significant dirty money problem for the best part of 30 years, where we welcomed in all forms of money, not only Russian, I would actually point to, money from kleptocrats across the globe. We were really facilitating the looting of many countries, including Russia, but others. So that's the context in which we're operating. But it's very difficult to reverse back out of those positions, as we've found. Again, to set a bit of context for non-UK listeners, The UK has the most stringent set of proceeds of crime legislation globally. Our powers go way further than most of our European counterparts, probably bar the Italians, who, for obvious reasons, who've had to put a focus on asset recovery. But we really have the tools and powers in place to do as much as you can in a liberal democracy where the rule of law is sacrosanct. And what we really need in this particular wicked problem that we face of having these known assets in the UK is evidence. The fact is we have this wonderful thing that I'm really, really keen on in the UK called the rule of law. We have the separation of powers. I'm really, really fond of these things. I really don't think we should throw them away by any stretch. And arbitrarily removing property from people just because you don't like the company they keep is not part of that compact, nor should it be. But to gather the evidence about the wrongdoing that's at the heart of some of those huge mansions in London's Kensington and Chelsea that we like to talk about, we require that evidence to come from, guess where? Russia. One, I'm not entirely sure we would have any sort of relationship to gather that evidence at all. It's completely broken down. We have very limited diplomatic relations. But at the same time, would that even stand in a UK court coming from where it's come from? Well, no. So we're stuck in this really tricky situation where there's circumstantial evidence. There's a number of reports out from, for example, think tanks like RUSI that I used to work for, Transparency International, other great NGOs doing work, but it doesn't amount to evidence. So our investigators are stuck in my old employer, the National Crime Agency, working out what to do about this. And I think fundamentally, we've seen investigators use even the most stringent of UK powers, like unexplained wealth orders, and even those powers which really stretch the limits of even the civil law aren't going anywhere near these types of assets. So I think we need to look at an alternative. We can't arbitrarily take these assets away. So we might have to look at things for the real asset recovery geeks listening in, things like reverse burden of proof, some of the powers, for example, that they have in places like Italy, South Africa, who have really had to go the extra mile and push the law to the limits. Even then, I'm not 100% convinced we get to where we get to. So I don't know where we go with this particular issue.
So what areas do you see this government tackling financial crime going forward?
Loads of issues. I think the real challenge the government's got, above all, is budget. We are in a very tight fiscal position. For non-UK listeners, we're talking about almost £40 billion deficit in spending. We have a spending review about to report. We have our first major budget of this Labour government coming in imminently. I'm very excited to see what they will put in the budget as regards financial crime. They haven't got a lot of money to play with, so it's going to be a real challenge from the get-go. We've already had something called the Economic Crime Levy in the UK, and this is, by any other name, a tax on the regulated sector to pay for its own AML responses. So to plough that money back into things like data analytics and cross-sector working and law enforcement activity. But that doesn't stretch beyond economic crime into things like fraud, which is going to have to be a real focus for the government. So will we start seeing, going forward, things like a social media levy to look at the fraud response? So I think that the real challenge they've got going forward is the budgetary situation. They want to do more. They've committed to do more in opposition. They haven't got a huge amount of money to play with.
Very interesting. So maybe just to get back a little bit on the subject of app fraud, during the election, Labour drafted plans to make tech companies liable to reimburse victims of online fraud. The document outlined a proposal under which banks would still have to refund fraud victims, but later recoup some money from tech companies. Will we see this government crack down on social media companies as the source of scams?
Oh, that's a really good question. And it's definitely the one everyone's talking about right now, particularly as mandatory reimbursements hit the banks. They are putting an immense amount of pressure on the government to do something about this. And to give the context to listeners who are less familiar with the fraud issue, around 3/4 of those scams originate online. So whether it's through a social media platform, whether it's through an approach on one of the dating platforms, for example, they originate online, yet the payment being made is made through a financial services sector who are then on the hook. So there's a huge amount of pressure to push some of that burden back up to the source. Course, whether you could actually work out how that split would work in practice what percentage would be due by, for example, people like Meta, if then the scam moves off into a telephone company, for example, and then through the financial services sector. Really difficult to work out that liability. What we've put forward in our fraud pledges manifesto that we put out during the election period was actually, let's look at a levy. It'll be much easier, almost like a polluter pays principle, but for fraud. Because any way you look at it, something has to be done about fraud, but there is no money in the UK system. And it's perhaps only fair that if further down the value chain, banks are shelling out, for example, and payment service providers are having to pay out their share, perhaps a contribution from the social media and tech companies might be a fairer split of the burden on this particular issue.
And what do you see as the growing trends in financial crime that this government needs to get to grips with?
Well, fraud, and more fraud. Of course, I'm going to say that I work in the counter-fraud industry, but actually it's the real driver of all action now. But, with fraud, there is money laundering. So we cannot look at the two in isolation. They've got to start putting those two policy areas together and looking at that value chain. You cannot split these out, as has always been the case, not only in policymaking, but also in the compliance sector, that they're seen as functionally very separate.
Yeah, we see more and more of these AML and fraud departments being merged together. They call it FRAML. Fraud and AML. I love that.
I absolutely love that. And more of the same. But then you need to, how would you stick cyber in there? I can't put a C in the middle of that, but you really need to bring the cyber resilience, Frackle, don't know. But anyway, FRAML, add in the C. That they're bringing those functionally together has to be the case. There's huge overlaps between the two. And you can't, interesting in the mandatory reimbursement policy for fraud that we're seeing in the UK, I think the really big thing that might not be as familiar with your listeners is the fact that it's a 50-50 split for a reimbursement between the sending bank, so the individual who sent the payment, and the receiving bank. So basically the mule account has to pay out 50%. That's going to focus minds quite a lot in some of those sectors that have perhaps not put a huge focus on fraud or AML, allegedly.
So what do you think that compliance professionals should prepare themselves for going forward?
Well, there's a few things. So beyond fraud, really interestingly in the UK, it's a difficult circle to square, but financial inclusion versus financial crime. And the financial regulator in the UK has certainly put a huge focus on this. But for non-UK listeners, I'll refer to what we call here in the UK Faragegate. And this was where a significant politician, if you are being polite about him, Nigel Farage, was debanked by his high-level bank Coots. And this led to a huge debate that really bled through into the financial crime arena, though it was not a PEP issue and it was absolutely not an AML issue, I should urge. But led to a huge debate about the debanking issue in general, which obviously led into kind of fraud, anti-money laundering, and the responsibility of the banking sector to retain customers.
Yeah, we actually have a full episode on debanking issue with guests from Fintrail. It's very much worth checking out.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. We work closely with Fintrail. The guys there are absolutely brilliant. So yeah, I think the debanking issue is not going away. The Labour government in opposition, we've not seen much on this yet, but put a real focus on financial inclusion. How do you square that circle? And the financial regulator has put a huge focus on the consumer duty, your duty to consumers, your need to drive financial inclusion, but at the same time tackle financial crime. So I think compliance professionals on the front line are between a rock and a hard place. Yes, you've got to identify financial crime, but no, you can't automatically debank people. So what is it you're doing? You're going to have to hold a lot of risk on your book that you're not necessarily comfortable holding. So I don't envy people on the front line because I don't think that debate's going anywhere. And I don't think anyone's going to offer compliance professionals the answer. How do you square the circle of financial crime and financial inclusion? I'm yet to see a really good answer to that one.
Yeah, great points there. So before we end this episode, we're going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. Are you ready?
I'll take a deep breath and let's go.
What grade would you give the first 100 days of this new government from a financial crime perspective?
I would definitely say points for trying.
If you were in charge, what would you do tomorrow?
I would definitely invest in a very different type of police force that's got a focus on cyber skills and not bobbies on the beat, as we'd say in the UK.
Why do government decisions on compliance, AML, and financial crime matter in the real world?
Because they have real world consequences. If we don't tackle this issue, we see that playing out not only on the streets. This is a crime that supports street level crimes like drug trafficking and the violence that goes with it. But it really impacts on our kind of the global perspective. It impacts on foreign policy and it impacts on our safety and place in the world.
And lastly, what's the biggest challenge still in the way from tackling the biggest issues?
Well, absolutely. What are the government going to do about those assets sat in the UK? Are they going to legislate? Are they going to go further and take quite arbitrary action? They'll certainly be under a lot of pressure to do something.
That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Helena, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
Well, definitely look at us on cifas.org.uk. Otherwise, I'm on Twitter at Helena CJ Wood.
Money makes a world go round.
And thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, review it, drop an episode in a group chat. It really helps people to find us. Got a story that you think we should be talking about? You can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Robin. Our producer was Matthew, our editor was Dominic, and our engineer was Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Makes a world go
Your money make a world go round.
Am I Englishing appropriately right now? It almost feels a bit ChatGPT.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.